Thanks for being here. There's I do town halls pretty regularly. Sometimes I do them on issues. Sometimes I just take general questions. I thought today would at least start out with an issue that I think is of extraordinary importance right now, given things going on in Washington and elsewhere. Trump's done a lot of things that I've been against, worked against, and many of them are very destructive. It goes from his denial of climate change and losing time there, or it goes to the fact that he wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act and has no replacement for it, to denying that Russia interfered in our election, and buddying up to dictators around the world. So those things are things that can be reversed with a new president and a different Senate. But we cannot reverse one thing that he might do, and I fear he might, which is to start a absolutely catastrophic war in the Middle East. The invasion of Iraq was the worst foreign policy mistake in the history of the United States, and it's still echoing in the region, and that's not likely to go away in my lifetime or lifetime of many in this room. But an unprovoked attack against Iran would make that seem like maybe it wasn't the worst foreign policy mistake in the history of the United States. This certainly would be. And his national security advisor, John Bolton, who was one of Cheney's henchmen in phoning up intelligence to go into Iraq, and he still says that Iraq was a success, in his opinion, has been publicly advocating for 13 years that we attack Iran. And they got Trump to pull out of the nuclear agreement, even though every inspector said Iran was in compliance. And since then, I've been trying to back Iran and provoke Iran, and almost attacked Iran about a month ago. And then 2 weeks ago, the president said he doesn't need to go to Congress. He's got Article 2. He can do whatever he wants. And he also somewhat, he does say strange things, started musing about nuking one of our allies, Afghanistan, but he's not going to do that. So I thought it was very timely to bring up war powers. I reintroduced my bill, and I've changed a little bit, and I'll get into some specifics about that. I wanted to have Garrett Epps here. Garrett's a constitutional a lawyer, law scholar, for a professor emeritus at U of O, and still teaching, has written on this subject, and has been a great help to me in crafting what could be a full assertion through war powers of congressional authority under the Constitution. So he'll talk for a bit. I'll talk about my bill. We'll take questions on that, and if we exhaust that subject, we can go on to other things. So Garrett.
Thanks.
Oh, got a mic down there. Great.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you. I want to thank Congressman Defazio, not just for inviting me, but yeah, I was his constituent for 16 years, and since then I've lived in Washington, D.C., and I've had the chance to do some comparison shopping, and you guys have done well in the market for congressmen, so so even though I'm a law professor, I'm going to try to be brief. The question becomes, why does President Trump believe he can do whatever he wants? And the reason is that his lawyers tell him that. And the reason that they tell him that is that they have pretty good reason to think that he can get away with virtually any assertion of military force that he wants. Go back, if you would, to April 2017, when the president saw some upsetting film on Fox News, and without even consulting members of Congress, immediately ordered a bombing attack on Syria. Syria, a sovereign nation with which we are not at war, and Congress has not authorized any use of military force against. This was the most lawless use of war powers I've seen, with the possible exception of Nixon's secret war on Cambodia. But the reaction in Washington among the foreign policy establishment of both parties and the Democratic leadership in Congress was praise for the president. None of the leaders raised the issue that it was illegal or not permitted under the Constitution. They said it was very presidential. And thank God he wasn't like Barack Obama, who in 2013 had asked Congress for authority to attack Syria, and when he didn't get it, didn't do it and was reviled as being weak. So the dialogue on war and peace in our nation's capital is very skewed. And the roots of this crisis, it's not just about Trump, it goes back 100 years. And I want to tell you a very brief story that illustrates it. In 1917, as we became a world power, President Wilson asked Congress for authority to put naval gun crews on merchant ships because there was some fear that even though we weren't at war with Germany, that Germany's navy was going to sink our merchant fleet on its way to England. Congress, that bill failed. Congress did not give him the authority, and there was a statute that said that there could not be naval gun crews on ships to fight against any country with which we were at peace. The president was furious. He directed his attorney general, he gave him 24 hours to come up with an opinion that said he had the authority to do it nonetheless. And within 24 hours, the attorney general did that because he said, well, yeah, the statute said with which we're at peace, and we're not at war with Germany, but we're kind of cheesed off at them, and that's not really peace, so you can do it. And Wilson went ahead and did it. And that is the pattern that we have seen whenever a president wants to make an end run around Congress. President Truman in 1950 said he had the authority under the UN Charter. He didn't need Congress. President Clinton, in his air war in Kosovo, said he had the authority under the NATO Charter, and he didn't need authority for that. President Obama, when he wanted to engage in air activities over Libya, produced an opinion that said that bombing Libya wasn't really hostilities, and so the war power resolution, it was friendly bombing of some sort, I guess, but the war powers resolution didn't apply. And the war powers resolution itself, as Congressman Defazio will tell you, was a historic moment, an attempt by Congress to regain its authority over the use of force. It's an important bill, but it has a flaw, and that is it states that the president has authority only to use force if we are attacked, where our troops are attacked, or if Congress authorizes the use of military force. And that is correct. That is what the Constitution says. But it then said that if there is a situation in which military force is used, the president can come to Congress within 60 days after using it, and if he doesn't get authority, he then has to withdraw the troops. The executive branch lawyers, using the same logic, have now said that this gives the president additional power, more power, not less, that he has his War Powers Act power to use military force for 60 days for any reason he wants. And I know that of the many interesting changes that the congressman wants to make in the War Powers Resolution, that's a really, really important one. I think that we are in a very dangerous situation. I think that the reaction on the ground now, during this congressional recess, to the idea of conflict with Iran could change our history one way or the other. And I am very heartened that so many people are out here to discuss this issue. And, you know, that was brief. I mean, could I get an applause? You know, I get 50 minutes out of that, you know, when I'm on the clock. So anyway, I will now turn you over to Representative Defazio.
Oh, thanks, Professor. His timer just went off, so he was very good. Is this thing working? Can you hear me? Okay, all right. It must be a good system, Heather, because it doesn't sound loud. Look, the three issues he just pointed out. One with war powers are there were two conflicting versions, a House version, and Senate version, and we ended up with the weaker version. And the weaker version did, as he said, the president can use force and then come after the fact to Congress for authorization. Well, that's a huge problem. Once the bullets start flying and casualties start mounting, coming to Congress and getting Congress to say, no, you must withdraw now, is a much more difficult prospect, to put it mildly. My bill would clearly enumerate only the Constitution, and it said the president can use force without authorization in only 3 cases: attack on the United States proper, attack on the armed forces of the United States, attack on United States citizens. Anything else would have to come to the Congress for prior authorization. The president would have to describe the scope, the objectives, and the expected duration, and an exit plan for the action. So that's one change. Now, and Garrett didn't talk about this. The other thing they're doing, in addition to saying war powers actually enhances his authority, and the president claiming Article 2 gives him all this authority, the third thing they're using is the authorization for use of military force, which is, I think, right there. That was passed after just days after 9/11, and the country had been attacked. The original request from the Bush administration was just extraordinarily broad, we were in the minority, but we're trying to, show a unified front, and it would have basically allowed the president to deem anybody, anywhere, a threat to the United States and use military force. We couldn't support that, and I went to then Minority Leader, or I guess she was Minority Whip, Nancy Pelosi, and told her, because I'd been working on war powers issues, I said, we've got to tighten this up a lot and make it look more like war powers. And we did, and the language ended up saying, those who perpetrated the attack, those who assisted the perpetrators, and those, who gave them, assistance in doing this. Now, the problem is we didn't put an end date on it. We thought that was pretty definitive, and we didn't say, okay, this expires after so much time. So President Obama relied on this. President Bush relied on this. That's a problem. So my bill would do a second thing, which is when we pass an initial authorization use of military force, it will have an end date. That doesn't mean we're saying that's the day the conflict ends, but we're saying that's the day your authorization ends. And if you have a rationale or a need for the American people to continue to support this activity, then come to Congress and ask again and make the case again to us. And then the third thing, which has been very frustrating, is the courts say that Congress has no standing in this matter to go to court. They say that, well, you have the power of the purse, so it's a non-justicable controversy. That is, you can cut off the funds. Well, imagine, the president's commander-in-chief, he's deployed the troops, we're taking casualties, we're in heavy battles, and Congress is going to say, we're cutting off your salaries, we're cutting off your support, and we're cutting off your ammunition. That's not going to happen. My bill would give Congress standing in the future should another president violate this authorization. Yesterday I did a meeting in Corvallis, and the New York Times called because they somehow knew about it and said they wanted us to live stream it, and we did. And it was a really, really good meeting, and they're showing some interest, and a number of the national peace groups have shown interest in my legislation, and I'm hopeful that I can convince the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee to hold hearings on it and move this bill forward this fall. Now, people say to me, well, Mitch McConnell won't do anything with it. Yeah, Mitch McConnell, that's another thing I have. I don't have it with me tonight, but Mitch McConnell's graveyard of legislation would pass on a host of issues. Oh, did I bring it? Oh, okay, yeah, there it is. I think we're really putting them on the spot because there are a lot of Republicans who are nervous about this. And the senior military in the Pentagon are very nervous about this. They do not want to go to war with Iran. They think it would be catastrophic. There would be massive casualties. then Iran's proxies would attack Israel, and then who knows what would happen in Syria, where Iran is heavily involved, and Russia's involved. And then you have the Strait of Hormuz, and when that gets blocked by mines or ships that are blown up, then you drag in China and Europe, and I mean this whole thing has the potential to become an international conflagration. So, very worried about this. There's lots of things to worry about. It's a beautiful summer night. I wish we didn't have to talk about this, but that's why I'm moving this forward now. So we have a microphone somewhere. Someone has, and they're going to, as you raise your hand, they will hand it to you. Yep.
Hi. I'm worried about all the treaty tripwires and all our bases that ring the world. I think most of us 100% behind what you're trying to do. And I was around in 1974, and I remember a little bit of the political jockeying that got that 60-day thing put in there. But what do we do? UN Charter, that's a treaty. NATO, that's a treaty. And I just think it needs to be brought up how we're going to address how we're spread out all over the globe. Mali, you get shot, Deja Voodoo. There's all kinds of things going on. I'm just using examples that people don't even know about, right? So how do we address what we do under treaty? Obviously honor them, but that's where we're going to go to war. There's all these tripwires. And second, as long as we're talking about the Constitution, I'd like to make this statement, maybe get a response. During an impeachment inquiry, wouldn't it be required and maybe even demanded that we see all of the Mueller report, all of your investigation, all the subpoena documents, including the tax returns? That would be wonderful. And I don't see how you can't do that during an impeachment inquiry. Hallelujah. Okay.
Well, since that was an observation question, I'll say, in fact, I believe that, we need to see an unredacted version of the Mueller report. I've read the redacted version twice. That leaves an awful lot of holes. Jerry Nadler, chair of the Judiciary Committee, has already requested that a court unseal the grand jury proceedings. Richie Neal from the Ways and Means Committee has gone to court to get Trump's tax returns. But Garrett can talk about this a little bit if necessary, but the issue is that we're being stonewalled, and the courts are considering this something that has to be litigated, not something that is like automatic. And they're doing that because the Trump administration is arguing that there's no legislative purpose. And I just, Garrett, would you just explain why? Okay, yeah, right. So.
What's happening right now is that Congress is using authority that it has used since the Washington administration, the oversight and investigative authority, which originated with the British Parliament, but it's not in the Constitution because the framers assumed that if we're setting up a legislative body, everybody understands this is one of the things that they do. And since that time, we've had a number of arguments between the branches where the president says I shouldn't have to turn over X or Y piece of information, and it's been negotiated. The two branches sit down in good faith, and one says, we can't turn this over to you because this is secret, and the other says we need this because of this, and it usually gets worked out, and Congress gets most of what it wants. Now, for the first time in American history, with this administration, we have a Justice Department that takes the position that Congress can't have anything if the president doesn't want him to have it. It's the most, with the exception of the attack on Syria, it's the most lawless thing that has been done since Trump was inaugurated, and that's quite a statement if you think about it. And the excuse they use is exactly as Congressman Defazio says. They say, oh, you want to see the president's tax returns, which the statute says they can. And they say, but we think you need to have a legitimate legislative purpose. You're not passing a statute. You just want to spy on the president. And this is being litigated in court. Now, we don't know what the courts are going to do. I've been trying to predict it for 30 years, and I'm always wrong. But one thing we do know is that while the oversight power is not in the text, the impeachment power is. The House of Representatives has the sole power of impeachment. That's pretty strong. And so if the House begins an impeachment inquiry, that's the strongest possible case in court for why the executive is obliged to turn material over. What judges will rule, I don't know. As of today, Trump has appointed 25% of the judges on the federal bench. But, you know, we could get lucky. So I think that, I know that Congressman Defazio has supported the idea of an impeachment inquiry. I think it's a really good idea because otherwise they are going to run out the clock and we are going to have one hell of a bad precedent set by this administration that Congress can't get information from the executive branch.
Yeah, Jerry Nadler, for some time, I had this conversation with him months ago because I'm not a constitutional lawyer, and I said, "Do you really think this will help us?" And he said, "Yeah," and he referred me to people similar to Garrett and Larry Tribe and others who said, yes, it will enhance the capability of getting a positive result in the courts. And I said, well, if you ask for a resolution, an impeachment resolution, a formal inquiry, I will support it. He has been restrained from asking for it by our leadership. And I just thought after the, rather weak performance of Bob Mueller that we just really needed to move forward. And I came out and said, I'm not waiting for Jerry to ask. I'm asking Jerry to ask, and I will support it. So that's where I'm at on that. And it will get presented. Oh, sorry. Treaties, I'm not an expert in treaties. Treaties are ratified by the Senate, and we have no say over treaties in the House. But, you need to be careful with to whom you are binding yourself and in what way you're binding yourself and what commitments you're making in treaties. But, that's really something to ask the senators about when they visit town. Thank you.
Thank you for being here tonight, both of you. I want to ask one big question, and then I'd like to ask a second question. Okay, so ever since Vietnam, I have wondered what is the really big difference between a conflict and a war? And how does it affect our troops that are fighting out there? And then I'll ask my second question when you're done.
Well, I'm not interested. I mean, if our troops are shooting at people and people are shooting back at them, that constitutes a war. It may be minor, major, or whatever. But I mean, that's hostilities. The War Powers Act talks about hostilities. Those are hostilities. Hostilities being, it doesn't mention the word war. It mentions if our troops are engaged in hostilities. So no matter what kind of conflict, he listed a number, or I can't remember, someone about how many countries we're in. None of those, many have not been authorized by the Congress, again, to be so dispersed around the world. When I was young, there was a protest singer who I really liked named Phil Oakes, and he had a song called Cops of the World. And I don't want to be the cops of the world. We shouldn't be the cops of the world, and we shouldn't be interfering in ways that often prove very unproductive, like in a way we created Iran. The way they are now, we've caused problems forever in Central America and South America, and we should just, keep our nose out of other people's business and their problems and or concerns.
The reason that I asked the question is because I was a military wife during Vietnam and have been really trying to get this answered since then. And then when Bush stood up on that ship and said the war is over as far as Iraq, we wondered, why was it over so fast when it wasn't over really? And so the answers that I have been getting so far, that it has to do with something with if you're on active duty, you get a certain you get certain benefits when you're on duty, not only the military person, but also the families. And I know that it affected us, it changed things when we were over there. So I'd really like to have more information about that. Maybe I could talk with you afterwards. Garrett?
But I don't know anything about the Defense Department.
Okay.
We can get some information on that. I think, I mean, there's hazardous duty pay. I don't know if there's something beyond hazardous duty pay, to tell the truth. Where are you? Yeah, no, I was looking to see if my veterans caseworker is here, and she's not. What? Oh, oh, there you are. So can you address that briefly? Or do you want to talk to her privately, or how do you want to do?
I'll speak with her
I
after.
have,
Okay.
but I have one more question.
Well, yeah, we should.
He did too.
What? Go ahead,
Let me
Gary.
just say, I just want to say one thing really quickly, because this raises the issue of what's a war and what isn't. And in fact, you know, people say, well, Congress has the power to declare war, so the war's illegal if it doesn't pass a document called declaring war. That's actually not correct constitutionally. An authorization for the use of military force, like the one passed in 2001, is the full war power of Congress delegated to the executive, and it doesn't matter what's at the top of the bill. And so, you know, as Congressman Defazio notes, we have to be kind of careful what's in those authorizations.
And I just further note, obviously, being of that generation, my brother served 2 tours in Vietnam. I was in the Air Force, but I didn't go to Vietnam. It was based on a false premise, the Gulf of Tonkin, and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which passed with only 2 dissenting votes, the senator from Alaska and Senator Wayne Morse. You know, I fear something similar happening in the Gulf. You know, that's a very narrow area. We've already, you know, where was our drone really when they shot it down? Where was their drone when we shot it down? And I can see very easily mischief could happen there, and even a third party could initiate an action to blame Iran, like Saudi Arabia, who would love to have us attack Iran, or even Israel, who would love to have us attack Iran. So I'm worried about how that could all happen, similar to the Gulf of Tonkin. So, okay, wherever they hand the microphone, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to your war powers bill that you have. First of all, what's the feeling of the Democratic leadership in the House, Eliot Engel and Nancy Pelosi et al., toward this bill? And am I right in my assumption that the Republicans won't like it?
Well, this is, as Garrett said, and as I said, this is not the first president, to abuse these powers. And so, yeah, at the moment, he's the most egregious, and he is the president, and he's putting us most at risk. But, this, in a way, also goes back to actions by President Obama, President Clinton, President Bush. And so it should be bipartisan. I fear that a lot of people look at it as partisan, but we can deal with that in the whereases and talk about the history and all those things. And this is not targeted at any one president. It's talking about the Constitution of the United States, our founding document, and you, for my colleagues, your authority over the most serious issues that you can deal with as long as you're serving as an elected representative, the issues of war and peace and sending our young men and women into harm's way and starting a conflict. So it shouldn't be. It may well be, but I would assume that Eliot, hopefully, and the Speaker will look upon it favorably. I'll have that conversation when I get back, and hopefully something won't happen between now and then, because we're out of Washington for another 5 weeks. So, okay, just keep handing the microphone around so people have their hands up.
Cool. Whoa, it's loud. Sorry.
Hold it don't hold the phone.
Oh, that's what it is. Sorry about that.
Okay.
All right. Let me start briefly by saying thanks to Mr. Defazio for honorably representing our interests here in Oregon. Your leadership is much appreciated in this time of chaos in our federal government. So the question is, your home state Senator Elizabeth Warren recently proposed a nuclear weapons policy to ensure the USA does not strike first with those apocalyptic bombs. I personally think it's a very progressive and positive move for the USA as a global leader. Question is, do you support this type of action? If so, how would you get Congress to make it a reality? She did have dissenters within the Democratic Party on the debate stage earlier this week, so I thought that was disappointing. And I'd also like to ask the guest professor his opinion on this type of policy becoming a reality. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you. Well, I did grow up in Massachusetts, but I've lived in Oregon for 50 years, so I wouldn't quite call it my home state. This is my home state, but I still have some cousins who live there. Anyway, I have supported, and we have in the past debated and passed resolutions on no first use. It's never become law. I can't remember the exact history of it. We can try and dredge it up. But no, I have long stated, and I believe voted in favor. I think we had some votes on it. I can't remember whether they were appropriations bills or freestanding bills, which stated no first use. And I think that is a sane policy for this country. I mean, we have the capability of destroying the earth with our nuclear weapons. So there's no reason to think that we should initiate their use. No sane entity is going to attack us with nuclear weapons. And Kim Jong-un might have some problems, but he's not nuts, and he's not going to shoot a missile at us. So I just don't believe it's necessary. Bolton and others would very strongly argue the other side that we have to hold that threat out. And I think that's a mistake, because then that puts everybody on a hair trigger. I still remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, where I didn't think I was going to wake up the next morning, thought we were going to have a nuclear war. I was very young, but I remember listening to it on the radio. So it's a frightening prospect. Garrett, he asked a question of you too. So.
Well, the one thing I'll say is, I'll say two things. The first is that in international law, it is clearly forbidden to use nuclear weapons. And the United States, of course, is the only country in the world to actually use a nuclear weapon in combat. But we have used nuclear weapons many times since the Second World War by threatening countries with nuclear attack implicitly, and that is illegal, and we shouldn't be doing it. And the other thing is that if we pass that, I think it's a great idea because it triggers the debate. I guarantee you executive branch lawyers, I know these guys, are going to come forward and say it's completely unconstitutional, the president can bomb anybody he wants. That's an argument worth having.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, just.
Congressman, thank you for your service and bringing this to our attention and listening to us. I may promote a little redundancy here, coming in late, but before this administration, we weren't in any position to be at war with Iraq or Iran. I mean, before this administration, we didn't have the best deal, but we weren't going to war. And second of all, as a congressman, and I can let the professor speak to this too, there's one thing about the executive, the commander-in-chief, declaring wars or getting our troops assembled and then calling it off 10 minutes before it's all going to happen. Anyway, to go make us all crazy like this without having any input from yourself or any other representatives of the Congress or the Senate whatsoever, but to declare war or to get the troops going or to do this all by tweet, come on now. This has got to be a little outrageous to yourself and everybody else that's a lawmaker. I think there's got to be something that says you can't tweet the war. Okay, thank you.
Maybe I can add that provision. You can't. That you can't.
Yes.
No, you made me laugh, and I forgot that. The first part was serious. Oh, well, the only reason, there's probably more than one reason Trump tore up, the second reason being Bolton and people like him, but the first reason that Trump tore up the agreement with Iraq is because Obama negotiated it. I mean, with Iran, is because Obama negotiated it. And it was successful. At the time that they entered into that agreement, the estimates were they were 9 to 12 months away from having an operable nuclear weapon. By the time they complied with the agreement, they exported enriched uranium. That was taken out of the country. They destroyed a bunch of their better centrifuges. And the current intelligence estimates, which have been written about in the press, so I can talk about them, are they're 24 or more months away, although now they're creeping back up. And so it was successful, it was working, and it did have the prospect of bringing them potentially into the world community. I mean, the Iranian people do not hold animus toward the United States. If we attack them, that'll all change. It's their leadership that's a problem, not Iranians. So, this is, you're exactly on point there, and I can't remember if there's anything else I didn't address, or I think I got it. So, yeah, okay. So, yeah, wherever the microphone is, speak up. Who's got it? Who's
Hello.
got it? Where is it?
I'm over here.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Hi. Bringing it again to nuclear war, I'd like to ask your position on nuclear power relative to, at Hanford is this old nuclear power plant, the Columbia Generating Station. And 5 years ago, the geologists with USGS pointed out from the new magnetic resonance geology scanning they're able to do from the sky, that they saw within 10 miles of the operating nuclear power plant, deep, 10-mile deep tectonic faults that are part of the Seattle fault that go from Seattle to the Wallowa Mountains, right through Hanford. And that nuclear power plant is shut down almost every year by its own self with a scram because it has a problem. Mm-hmm. And I feel unsafe with that running. It makes 4% of our electricity. I checked with eWeb today. So 4% of the electricity we use is coming from there, but we have a lot of windmills. And I would like to know your position on shutting the Columbia Generating Station.
Okay, well, you probably don't know my history, but I led litigation which stopped them from building 3 more nuclear plants quite some time ago. And, unfortunately, that one, we had a court case on 4 and 5, which this is one of those 2. If I remember my numbers correctly, they were proposed 5, and we lost that court case, but we won the other one to stop the other 3. And then they gave up on one on their own. No, we don't need it. In fact, today I had a roundtable at eWeb, and we're on the verge of being able to produce sustainable hydrogen by cracking water, by using our surplus power. We have quite a bit of surplus power, and the key thing is there are times in big cold snaps and you're not getting much runoff and the wind isn't blowing and you get an inversion where we need backup generation. And the idea is that we would do the backup generation by using that surplus power. Sometimes we actually pay people to take power or get nothing for it. We would instead generate hydrogen and have backup plants that could be powered by sustainable hydrogen as opposed to firing up the nuke out there. So I think the key thing is we got to figure out what to do with the waste. I said, we should have a rule that we don't create anything that we don't know what to do with for 10,000 years because it's dangerous. And, but our region does not need that plant. So,
Congressman.
Yep.
Over here.
Thank you so much for your service. We're so lucky here in Oregon to have someone like you representing us. I am concerned, though, if I'm understanding correctly, that you voted recently for the military budget to be raised even higher than it ever has been before. And I'd like you to explain that, because that really concerns, I'm sure, many people in this room.
Sure. Well, if you read my statement, I said I don't, I can't remember the last time I voted for a military authorization, and I've led a fight in Congress for years to audit the Pentagon, the only agency of the federal government that can't be audited and isn't audited. Every other agency is audited every year and scored. I once passed an amendment to require an audit, but it went away in the conference committee. What I said in that statement was I don't like the numbers in here. We tried to reduce what's called the OCO account, which is a slush fund. But I really like the policy. This is Democratic policy. It ends the authorization for use of military force, which I'm, which we've talked about, which they could use as a rationale, prohibits the president from using military funds to build a wall on the border. It says that we can no longer support the Saudis in Yemen. It says that he can't preemptively attack Iran. There is a host of good policy in that bill. I don't like the number, but that was ultimately, a compromise, and the alternative was the bill goes down and we work off the Senate bill, and the Senate bill does not contain any of those provisions and has higher numbers. So, this puts us in a position to potentially get good policy. I fear in the end we won't, and in that case, I'll be voting against the final product because it's too much money and too much of it is wasted.
Thanks for having these discussions on war powers. Following World War II, everybody on Earth wanted to have no more of that to ever happen again, and they had the Nuremberg sorts of doctrines, and so we need to examine the results of that. The score is 3 major wars, 2 million we killed in the Korean War who never attacked America, not self-defense. 3 million in Vietnam War, never attacked America, no Vietnamese ever attacked America, and then the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Those were wars where nobody attacked America. The nations did not attack America. So that is the Bush doctrine has now taken place, that now the president can say, oh, because there might be terrorism somewhere, this is the Bush doctrine, we can go and fight everywhere in the world because that's the only way to keep ourselves safe. So for the sake of safety. So then he attacks Iraq, okay, which is nothing but an oil war. And so we need to address this at the level of doctrine. And I feel that you're, as beneficial as they are, those are incremental issues, And I'd like to see something like a constitutional amendment that no war shall be waged except to defend the territory of the United States, since politicians have proven incapable of restraining special interests and claiming that all these wars are for American interest or for American safety when actually they're not.
Okay. Well, my whole purpose here is to get at least back to the Constitution saying the presidents aren't kings and they can't have wars unilaterally without the consent of Congress. And I've had to vote on wars. Bush won. I voted against. That was my first war. Bush 2, I voted against. I did vote for the authorization of use of military force. Only one person didn't, but that was to go after al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Now, there's some people who think that was all a U.S. government plot and that didn't really happen. I don't, and I think that we were attacked by an organized terrorist organization, and we needed to not let them range around and cause more problems. But then that has been used far beyond the scope of its intent, and that's why I'm offering as part of my bill that these things expire, so they can't live in perpetuity. And then finally, there's, I'm not an expert, and no one's ever offered a constitutional amendment like that I'm aware of, but there are a lot of restraints in the Constitution itself. And of course, the constitutional amendment process is very torturous, and I would like to start with undoing Citizens United in terms of and campaign finance reform, because you talked about special interests. Well, that's how special interests get and bend the Congress to their will, and this flood of money that comes into these campaigns that are not representative campaigns or people of a majority of the American people. So that, and there's a few others I'd like to, but that's one I'm on right now. I'm on that constitutional amendment to undo Citizens United. So, I can't tell what the mics are. There we go. Yeah.
By way of seeking reassurance in tumultuous times, let me ask for some speculation. If the president were to order something really, really stupid, would the military follow those orders and do whatever he commands?
Well, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, I was in the military, says that you have the right to disobey an unlawful order. And should the president say he was going to nuke Afghanistan like I don't know whether he's joking or musing or fantasy. I don't know what that was about. And he wanted to do it. I would assume and hope that the Joint Chiefs would say, no, that's an unlawful order, and not execute it. I don't know this new secretary very well. I was pretty comfortable for a Trump appointee with Jim Mattis, and he reined in Trump a number of times. I don't know the new person. I don't know whether he'll be a voice of reason. I'm very worried, but I have no say because it's a Senate confirmation on this totally unqualified, partisan that he wants to make head of the Director of National Intelligence, who will just tell Trump whatever he wants. I think that, I had questions or concerns about Ms. Haskell at CIA and her role in the interrogation process, but I think since she's been there, she has shown that she has been, there was a very interesting article just this last week about how she just tries to stay out of the White House because she's, taking positions that Trump, but for the agency that Trump doesn't support, but she doesn't want to get in his face and doesn't want to get removed, but she wants to protect the agency and their integrity. So, so I'm worried about the cast of characters we're confronted with, and I don't know the current head of the Joint Chiefs. I haven't met him, so.
I have a question.
Sure, we're okay. There. Okay, sorry.
I'm Vietnam era. My first husband was in the Vietnamese War, and I remember seeing maps of the Vietnamese peninsula. All the oil companies had mapped out their little sections of the coast offshore drilling, and there were also rubber plantations in Vietnam. There's essential elements, I believe they're called, in Afghanistan below the mountains, and there's lots of oil in the Middle East. I believe that's why we are in those countries. And my question is, maybe I'm naive, but why can't the U.S. have some diplomacy and just buy the minerals, buy the oil from these companies, from these countries, and let them live and be prosperous, and we can be prosperous and save one hellacious amount of money and lives. This is my biggest question. I don't understand the war, and why can't we just buy it from these people?
Yeah. Well, we do buy it, and we do buy too much, and we have been too dependent upon the Saudis for too many years. Whenever I talk about the Saudis, I say our friends, the Saudis. The Saudis are a totally corrupt kingdom who have been exporting the most radical form of Wahhabism to other countries. Pakistan, they've substantially disrupted Pakistan with the madrasas. I was in the Balkans 2 years ago with the Judiciary Committee. And they are very active there, they have a very almost secular form of Muslim worship there, and they're now will pay people to put their daughter in chador. They'll pay you if you send your kids to the radical mosque for education. They're trying to disrupt that. So they've cut a dirty deal with their religious zealots that will let you do anything you want anywhere but here in Saudi Arabia. And so, I mean, that's part of it. Oil is obviously a huge part of it. Struggle over resources. I think it's I think it's something for lithium batteries that's in Afghanistan. I'm not sure what it is. And so I do think that in part when Bush II went into Iraq, there were a number of factors, but one was the fact that they had, I think for him it was personal because they tried to kill his father. For Cheney, it was, a whole different thing, phony intelligence. And I think that with the involvement of, I'm trying to think of that big evil company, Halliburton, where he came from, it was about the oil resources and getting control of the oil resources in that region. And, you heard that at the time. So you're right. A number of times that now Vietnam was a little different. I don't, I'm sure they have some pretty good resources, but and that was a Cold War thing, and the domino theory and all that stuff, which was not founded in reality. In fact, had we let Ho Chi Minh run that country, he would have run it like Yugoslavia, like Tito, and he wouldn't have been a problem for us at all. So that was another huge mistake we made. But I think we, I shouldn't always go around saying that Iraq, but in my time in Congress, for certain, the invasion of Iraq was the worst foreign policy mistake in the history. Vietnam was a pretty big one too. So anyway, so.
Good evening. We've all heard about what Mueller's most concerned about, our voting and the Russians in our systems and in our power grids. And can you tell us, if Congress is not able to move this with McConnell at the helm in terms of working on our elections, what can we do as a state? Is there any thought in terms of that, of how we can protect ourselves, protect our voting abilities? How do we know if our votes are going to be considered correctly?
We're lucky as a state in that we have a paper ballot which is read by a machine. And they do random sampling for, of those ballots, and then anybody can ask for a recount. So we have a paper record. There are a number of states, I can't remember the number right now, I think it's around 10 or 12, or I think it's 13 maybe, that have no paper backup. And it's been shown that they can be hacked. I mean, they could certainly, and, they disrupted in ways, they did apparently access databases in almost all the states. What they intended to do with that, or what they might intend to do with that, we don't know. But we have absolute denial on the part of Trump that his buddy Putin did any of this. Putin told him he didn't and wouldn't, and yet, I mean, all the intelligence agencies say yes. And if you read the Mueller report, the first part has redactions, but it makes one heck of a case about Russian interference in the election, and more than trying to maybe tap into databases, but in terms of what they did in social media and all the other things that compromise the things they do. The Russians, was a big tradition in the Soviet Union. They've revived it, and Putin, of course, was an intelligence agent. So it's a tremendous concern. They seem finally to have gotten on. McConnell has been very proud of being a jerk and blocking everything, but it really got under his skin when they've started to call him Comrade McConnell. And so I just think we all ought to go on social media and congratulate Comrade McConnell for blocking, protection and running interference for his friends in Russia. So that's, but it's very serious, and it worries me. But we ultimately, I mean, worst comes to worst, they did hack the machines and everything goes crazy, and then we're going to be sitting around counting ballots for a long time. But we will have a real record. They can't compromise your ballot when you put the pen to the ballot, and they're all kept safe. The county elections keep them. So, and that's part of the bill, is to mandate that every state have a paper backup. So, there's still questions from Bush v. Gore about Ohio. There were counties that cast more votes than they had, and those were proprietary voting machines of a company run by a right-wing guy. So, you can't just have electronic machines. You just can't do that. So.
Thank you, Congressman, for being here. I appreciate all the information you've shared. I appreciate your visuals here, especially the amount of American lives and other lives that have been lost because of endless wars. I think there's a direct line that can be traced from some of the rationalization for the endless wars to what's happening with Trump administration policy as it relates to family separation and how children are being treated at the border. And I'd like to know specifically how you are using your influence in your office to stop how children are being treated, and how, similar to the previous gentleman's questions, how we as citizens can be active with urgency to stop this, because I feel like personally that I'm becoming complicit in how these children are being treated. So, thank you.
Well, I don't think you voted for Donald Trump, and neither did I, so I'm not going to accept complicity, but it's just extraordinary abuse. We had a dispute just before the July break over this issue. We passed after quite a bit of effort, not by a huge margin, but we passed a bill in the House that pretty much would have ended all of the abusive policies that we're seeing in terms of detention, in terms of where people are housed, in terms of access to medical care, food, all those things. And separation of families. We passed separate legislation on separation of families, but that was also in that bill. And the Senate, the Homeland Security and others said, we're out of money. We're not even, as much as they were, whatever they were feeding people, we're not going to be able to feed people anymore. We can't do this. And so there was a feeling that money had to be appropriated. The House bill appropriated the money, but with very stringent conditions on the agencies and how that money would be spent. No more unlicensed facilities, et cetera, and no more, family separation, no more holds of juveniles or youth for more than 48 hours, et cetera. And the Senate passed a bill that just had the money and didn't have any of that. We went right up to the beginning of the break, and unfortunately, the Speaker didn't think she had the votes to hold, and so she allowed a vote on the Senate bill. I voted against it. I thought we should have just stayed in town and continued to fight over it. And we have since put provisions in an appropriations bill on these issues. I was last weekend when I got back on Sunday, we went up to visit I flew into Portland to visit the Morrison Family Services, who has unaccompanied youth, and they're under capacity right now. So our question was, well, why can't we take youth out of Homestead and put them here? And we visited, they had 3 separate programs we visited, and one was a secure facility, and these were youth who had either severe, behavior problems, issues, but they were getting counseling, or they had some kind of known criminal background. But we talked to one of the youth there, and he had left his village in Guatemala, and he had taken him a long time to get here, 16 years old. He said, I was either going to be in a gang or they're going to kill my family or kill me, and I came. And he got to the border, and it's like, finally. And then he was detained by ICE, and ICE were real, they were bad. And they, told him Guatemalans were enemies of the United States and all this stuff. And he said, at that point I thought, I'm really sorry I left, even with the threat of the gangs and that. And then somehow, and he lucked out, he got the lucky card, he got sent to Morrison. And generally people get sent to Morrison because they have some sort of nexus to Oregon. They have family, relatives, somebody here that preceded them, and they'll send them here until they can clear them out to go into the home through the Office of Refugee Assistance. But he got sent to Morrison, and he was in the secure facility, and he said, now I'm happy I came. He said, these people are good to me. He said, I'm getting counseling, I'm in school, and I want to, become a mechanic, and then I can send money home and help my family. And then we went over to the other facility downtown where they have 2 different groups, and one group of youth is just pending the clearance of their, essentially their, it's not adoption, but getting associated with relatives and placement. And the other group don't have a place to go. and they're going to Lincoln High School, but they can come and go freely out of that facility. And we had, conversations with those kids. And I mean, when you look at a 13-year-old kid who did this on their own, and here they are, we should be going after the root cause. Trump has gone 180 degrees in the wrong direction. We had a very modest amount of money, nowhere near enough, that we were investing in the Triangle and those three countries. And most of the money was not going to the corrupt government. It was going to the non-governmental organizations who were there to help these kids or help families, or provide for employment opportunities, to help provide counseling, help get people, move them from one village to another to get away from gangs. They were doing a lot of really good stuff. And Trump got mad and cut off all their aid. And so he went exactly in the wrong direction. We need to be investing something like the Marshall Plan down there, and helping rebuild those societies. When I was in Eastern Europe with in the Balkans with the Judiciary Committee, we have police officers. I met two from Oregon who are over there teaching people how to do legitimate policing. We have judges over there who are teaching them how to have rule of law and judicial process. We should be doing that down there in Middle America, in those countries, to help stop what is driving people out of the country. These aren't people who woke up one day and said, "Oh, I can go to America and get a good job, and I just kind of want to do that." That's not what's going on. And unless we go to the root cause, they're going to keep coming because they're desperate. And the alternative is, well, you're going to be killed, or your family's going to be killed, or other horrible things. If you're a young woman, you're probably going to be sexually exploited. So we need to deal with that. And unfortunately, right now, he's taken us in the wrong direction. So I hope that addresses your question. So, yeah, okay.
Good evening. Thank you. And thanks to everyone in this room. We all need to be together on these issues now. So for words in this room tonight, do we have U.S. military people serving in the detention centers at the border now? Is that true? Okay.
It would be a violation of law if they were there, because they can't do civilian law enforcement. What they've been doing, they're not military. They've been taking, in the ones that are not, most of them, a lot of them are being run like Homestead as a private entity, so there's no government employees there. Others are being run by Homeland or Health and Human Services, and what Homeland has done is they have detailed or taken people from being TSA agents or being Border Patrol agents and put them in these facilities. But to the best of my knowledge, that's one law they're not violating, and they're not using uniformed military. Trump has deployed uniformed military to the border, but it's mostly symbolic because they can't arrest people, and they're there to provide support to the Border Patrol, is what they say. And there were senior military officers who were very, very upset about that whole thing, that they were even being sent there. So.
Okay. And also, do we know where the children from Homestead were schlepped to?
There's a fair number of unaccounted for children at this point in time, and Congress, on a bipartisan basis, that's one where the Republicans agreed, has asked not as much as we wanted in our bill, but they have asked for accounting and reporting and reassociation. So that's one place where Republicans even are outraged in Congress, that you can't be separating kids from their families. And then there's also one other thing, if I can just put in a plug, and there's a group that I've been raising money for called Kids in Need of Defense, KIND. And you can go to my campaign website. I'm not supposed to talk about the campaign here, but you can go there, and we have a link, and you can donate. And they provide legal defense to kids like in Homestead and others to help them get out. I mean, the way it works, they'll even take a minor, like, here you are, you're in the immigration court, you're 5 years old, and you don't speak the language, and you're representing yourself. I mean, the absurdity of some of what they're doing and the cruelty of it is just amazing. So I wish more people were totally outraged. Yep. I know, Dan, we're a little over, but let's see. We got someone over here. There's a woman in the second row right there.
I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the wall.
Yeah.
Pardon me.
Okay.
And the diversion of funding, and apparently it's being built, even though most of us don't want it.
Well, that bill that was rejected by the Senate prohibited the wall. The defense authorization bill that passed the House prohibits the wall. That prohibits funds from the Pentagon being diverted to the wall. Again, back to why I voted for something that had too much money in it, but the policies I liked, and prohibited the wall. The president says the wall is about drug smuggling, and nothing's further from the truth. If you go to Guzman's trial, his associates testified that they don't haul drugs across the desert in backpacks. They put them in semis and they take them through legal ports of entry because we only inspect 6% of the trucks with high technology. And now more and more they're using the oceans. And I don't know if you saw the video, but there was a video. Actually, one of my staff's his son was engaged in that video that you saw where they jumped on a submersible and for a Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard has interdicted more drugs than all the other agencies in America combined, yet their budget's inadequate. And the commandants get a little more outspoken when they're getting to retirement. So Admiral Zumkov, just before he retired, was testifying, and he said, we have actionable intelligence on probably 80% of the drugs coming into the United States, and I have the resources to intercept 20% in terms of ships, helicopters, and coasties. And our military can't do that. It has to be the Coast Guard because they can't do civilian law enforcement. So I just passed a Coast Guard bill with my colleagues' support out of my committee that increases the budget for the Coast Guard. And I keep beating on this. And I said, if you want to spend $5 billion, $7 billion on I don't know how people remember the Maginot Line that the French built, and the Germans went around it through the Ardennes forest in like 6 hours. That's what building a wall is about, because they're coming through the ports of entry and now they're going around on the seas. So if we want to be effectively interdicting drugs, the Coast Guard would be a much better investment if we got an extra $5 or $7 billion or whatever his stupid wall is going to cost. But he has, he did divert some money out of the last Pentagon allocation, which didn't have the prohibition, and hopefully we will hold that prohibition through conference with the Senate. And it's being contested in the courts, and the court didn't rule that he could do it, but the court wouldn't do an injunction. So I'm afraid that they're going to be out there slinging bricks and mortar or whatever they're going to make this thing out of, and I think that was $2 billion wasted for something that isn't going to have any impact. I mean, most of the people he's upset about are walking up to the Border Patrol and saying, "I'm requesting asylum in the United States of America," and they're not even sneaking through the desert, and they're not carrying drugs. But anyway, that's why he wants to build a wall for no reason. Anyway, my voice is running down. Thanks very much for being here. I appreciate it. Good questions. Thank you.